Here's a sentence I genuinely never expected to say on this podcast. You can now get a discount on your Botox or brow lift thanks to your local LA grocery store. Erewhon, the Los Angeles grocery chain that turned a Hailey Bieber strawberry smoothie into a cultural status symbol, just announced a partnership with Ject, which is a med spa company. And in today's episode, I'm going to take you through why this is actually an honest encapsulation of where the med spa industry is now and where it's going. Because the med spa boom didn't happen suddenly. It's been building for over a decade, fueled by changing beauty norms, loosening regulations, social media, and an enormous amount of private equity money that has spotted an opportunity, and it is moving quickly. I'm Sammi Cohen, and this is Social Currency, a podcast that unpacks the stories that are shaping business, culture, and the intersection of the two. So today we're going to cover how the med spa industry went from a small niche to a booming multi-billion-dollar business. We'll talk about the private equity playbook that's reshaping the space, and we'll get into the risks that come with rapid consolidation in an industry built on medical procedures. And I'm going to save my single biggest takeaway, the thing that determines who actually wins in the space long term, for the very end. So to understand how we got here, you have to go back to 2002. That's when the FDA approved Botox for cosmetic use, and it introduced a genuinely novel concept to the American consumer. It was the idea that you could walk into a clinic, spend 30 minutes, and walk out looking measurably younger without surgery or major downtime or commitment. The demand was almost immediate. The existing medical infrastructure wasn't built to handle it. There weren't enough dermatologists, there weren't enough appointment slots, and like any market with unmet demand, a new kind of business emerged to fill the gap. Med spas, aka medical spas, are essentially hybrid businesses. They're licensed to administer injections and other clinical treatments, but they're designed to look and feel more like a boutique wellness studio than a doctor's office. And that positioning was deliberate, and it very much worked. The numbers help to tell the story. In 2010, there were roughly 1,600 med spas across the US. By 2023, that figure had crossed 10,500. The American Med Spa Association projects the industry could reach 13,000 locations by the end of this year. So to put that density into context, the entire US McDonald's network sits at just over 13,500 locations. We are fast approaching a parity between fast food and cosmetic injectables. And average revenues per med spa location hit nearly $1.4 million in 2024, with roughly 75% of patients returning for treatments. These numbers are insane. So what turned a promising niche into a $17 billion industry growing at roughly 15% a year? A few things compounded at exactly the right moment. So let's start with the regulatory environment. After 2010, many states began allowing nurse practitioners and physician assistants to establish and operate aesthetic practices without a physician physically on the premises. And that lowered the barrier to entry dramatically. Industry consultants describe it as a business that you can launch within a couple of months with way less upfront capital than you would need for other industries, especially for providers who already are licensed. And because med spas operate almost entirely outside of the insurance system, there's cash pay, no reimbursement delays, and no billing bureaucracy, the economics are very attractive. Well-managed practices can target 20 to 30% margins, and that is a number that gets investors' attention very quickly. The second accelerant was cultural. Social media was arguably the single biggest force behind the industry's renaissance, and there's a lot of data to support that. Instagram made before and after content mainstream, and TikTok accelerated the normalcy of getting these med spa treatments done further. What was once a private and somewhat stigmatized personal choice became something that people documented, discussed, and recommend to their friends. It became normal to have honest conversations about what people had done to their faces, and the consumer base has shifted significantly. Demand for non-surgical cosmetic treatments rose 79% over the last 5 years, according to the American Society of Plastic Surgeons. And 75% of plastic surgeons have reported a spike in patients under age 30. This is no longer a category defined by any single demographic, because the appeal has broadened across age groups, income levels, and backgrounds. Now that we've covered the rise of med spas, here is where the business story gets super interesting. If you own a thriving med spa today, you have almost certainly heard from a private equity firm. In fact, successful med spa operators are fielding calls from dozens of private equity firms. And the interest makes complete sense once you map the industry against what PE looks for: high margins, cash based revenue, repeat customers, recession resilient demand, and a fragmented market of thousands of small independent operators who can theoretically be rolled into larger, more efficient platforms. One investor who has spent years in the space described these medical aesthetics as a unicorn for private equity, a scalable, multi site healthcare model with a cash pay structure that sidesteps virtually all of the headaches that make traditional healthcare businesses difficult to own. And lots of major capital has already moved in. Ideal Image, the largest med spa brand in the US, has backing from L. Catterton, which is a firm with ties to LVMH. Everbody, a premium urban chain, is backed by Tiger Global. BC Partners recently committed $120 million to Princeton Med Spa Partners. And these are just a handful of the many acquisitions and investments that have been made in this space over the last decade. The strategy these firms are running is a version of what private equity did with hospitals and vet clinics: acquire independent operators, centralize back-end functions like HR, marketing, IT, legal, purchasing, strip out redundancy, and then build a platform that generates returns at scale. Bulk purchasing of injectables alone creates meaningful cost advantages since the manufacturers tier pricing based on volume. And yet, and this context matters, private equity currently owns only about 3% of med spas in the US. The vast majority of the sector, it's estimated more than 80%, is still single location, independently operated. The consolidation wave is still quite early, and that runway is long. And that's why the capital is so eager in the space right now. The valuations reflect that optimism too. Smaller practices trade at 3 to 6 times EBITDA. Large multi-site platforms with strong recurring revenue and membership programs are commanding anywhere from 8 to 11 times. And investors are pricing in continued growth. And so far, the industry has consistently delivered it. Now let's talk about the part of the story that doesn't make it into the investment pitch decks. The med spa industry has grown faster than the oversight systems designed to govern it. Licensing requirements vary dramatically from state to state: who can inject, what supervision is required, what counts as practicing medicine. In some markets, a medical director must be physically present during procedures. In others, being technically reachable by phone is sufficient. Those are very different standards of care when something goes wrong, and things do go wrong. In 2024, the FDA identified counterfeit Botox administered across 11 states over a 5-month period. Dozens of patients reported adverse symptoms. Some required hospitalization. And that same year, federal health authorities investigated a cluster of HIV transmission cases linked to improper infection control practices at a med spa. And this was the first documented instances of HIV contracted through cosmetic procedures in the US. Obviously, these are very extreme cases, but they illustrate what happens when rapid market expansion outpaces quality control. And for private equity specifically, there is yet another structural risk that's specific to this category. Unlike hospitals or vet practices where the brand carries continuity, med spa clients tend to be loyal to their individual provider, not to the business itself. When a favorite injector leaves, their patients frequently follow them out the door. And PE firms are not historically known for the kind of retention culture that keeps the talented, in-demand clinicians around for the long haul. That's a real tension in the roll-up model that doesn't exist in the same way elsewhere. All right. So here is the takeaway that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, and I've been alluding to it. The uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this entire industry is that Botox is Botox. The stuff going into your forehead at a $500 a visit boutique chain should be chemically identical to what's being offered at the no-name storefront just blocks away. The fillers, the lasers, the GLP-1 shots, these are basically commodified products. The brands may be different, but if you're using the same product from the same brand, it should be the same. The procedure itself is not the differentiator. What that means is that in a world where med spas have now over 10,000 locations and counting, the only real competitive advantage a med spa has is the person holding the syringe. The skill, the artistry, the judgment to know when less is more, that lives in a human being and not in a brand or a platform or a private equity-backed management structure. And this is exactly where the roll-up model starts to crack. Private equity is very good at centralizing operations, cutting overhead, and extracting value from the infrastructure of a business. What it is historically not as good at is creating the kind of culture, compensation, and long-term ownership opportunity that really makes a talented in-demand provider want to stay. PE firms work on 5 to 7 year exit timelines, and they're optimizing for a sale, not for a 20-year relationship between a practitioner and their clients. And when that practitioner leaves, taking their client book, their reputation, their Instagram following with them, the platform that paid a premium multiple to acquire that clinic is left holding something far less valuable than what they paid for it. And the med spas that win the next decade will be the ones that treat their best providers less like employees and more like partners. That potentially means equity stakes or real profit sharing. It means a genuine reason to stay beyond a salary that a competitor can always outbid. And even as I'm saying this out loud, I know that this is extremely unlikely to ever happen in private equity because that's not how their model works. Yet I still stand by the fact that when the product is commodified, the person delivering it becomes even more valuable. So whoever figures out how to lock that in without the heavy-handed cost cutting that PE is notorious for will build something genuinely defensible in an otherwise crowded market. And the broader lesson for anyone watching an industry consolidate in real time is this: ask yourself what the actual differentiator is once the product becomes a commodity. In med spas, it's the injector. In other industries, it'll be something else. But the businesses that identify that differentiator and protect it rather than churn through it are always the ones still standing when the consolidation wave settles. Med spas are not going away. The demand is real, the economics work, and the cultural tailwinds are still blowing strong. But the companies that define this space in 10 years will be the ones that understood the commodity trap early enough to build around it. And that is your social currency for today. If this one resonated, share it with someone who's paying attention to where business and culture intersect, because that's what we're doing here every week. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Social Currency. Before you go, take a second to subscribe to the show wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. And if you liked what you heard today, please rate and review the podcast. It massively helps the work I do to bring this show to life. And if you have a friend who is as obsessed with business and culture as you are, send this episode to them because sharing the show is one of the best ways to support it. And if you want to keep up with the hottest business lore in real time, follow me on Instagram at Sammi Cohen Talks and subscribe to my newsletter, Social Currency, linked in the show notes. Social Currency is a production of Social Currency Media and Money News Network. The podcast is hosted and executive produced by me, Sammi Cohen, and produced by the Money News Network team. See you next time.